Man, look at my beautiful ass wife. This is what you call a mission complete. My wife was like, babe, can I go step out and have a few drinks with the young ladies, the girls? I said, but you goddamn right. I said, you tell them one thing, that you take it and you motherfucker.
It was just after 4:30 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning in Alexandria, Louisiana, when the peace was suddenly shattered. A call came in to local authorities. Another domestic disturbance, another moment of tension behind closed doors. But no one could have predicted the heartbreaking reality that officers would find just minutes later. Inside a modest home on Ron Mar Drive, 38-year-old Shaterica Danielle Smith lay fatally wounded. Not far from her, the man authorities believe pulled the trigger, 42-year-old Tracy Johnson, was also found, dead from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. What began as a call for help had ended in unimaginable tragedy, a suspected murder-suicide that left 2 lives lost and a community in shock. To the responding officers, it was a scene they wouldn't soon forget. The early morning stillness stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had just occurred inside that home. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the dark street, but no answers could illuminate the question on everyone's mind. What led to this? Shaterica wasn't just another name in a police report. She was known for her strength, her warmth, and her unwavering commitment to her work and family. As a corrections officer at FCC Pollock, she was respected by colleagues and loved by many. Her loss has sent a ripple of grief through every person who knew her, and even those who didn't but have since come to know her name. Tracy Johnson, whose life ended by his own hand, left behind a painful silence. Whatever happened between them in those final moments, we may never fully understand. But what's clear is that something went terribly wrong in the hours, or perhaps even years, leading up to that violent morning. Murder-suicides are complex. They leave behind broken families, haunted memories, and an overwhelming number of unanswered questions. And while police have determined this was a domestic incident, they continue to search for any details that can help piece together the full story. What signs were missed? What moments of help went unheard? As the sun rose over Alexandria that morning, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. Neighbors slowly came out of their homes, stunned by the news. Family members received devastating calls. And somewhere in that quiet grief, the name Shaterica Smith began to echo, not just as a victim, but as a woman whose life mattered deeply. For those left behind, including friends, co-workers, and loved ones, the pain is only beginning. And as investigators look for answers, the community is left holding its breath. Try and make sense of how such tragedy can unfold so quietly, so quickly, and so permanently. This isn't just a story about what happened. It's a story about who was lost, about the fragile nature of human connection, and about the importance of listening, to cries for help, to moments of distress, to those quiet signs that something might be wrong behind closed doors. Because sometimes, the most tragic stories don't begin with screams. They begin in silence and end with lives we can never get back. And that's why we tell these stories. To remember, to reflect, and to ensure that the next time someone's light starts to dim, we recognize it before it's too late. Before she became the subject of heartbreaking news reports and crime scene investigations, Shaterica Danielle Smith was simply a woman living her life, with dreams, responsibilities, and a heart full of purpose. She was 38 years old. But in many ways, her journey was just beginning. Those who knew her say she had a calm strength about her, a presence that made others feel safe, seen, and respected. Shaterica worked as a corrections officer at FCC Pollock, a role that demands resilience, self-control, and courage. She showed up for work not just to earn a paycheck, but to serve. It takes a certain kind of character to do that job, and she had it. She was known among her colleagues as dependable, professional, and composed, even in the most stressful situations. Outside of work, she was a woman with a personal life that mattered. She had family. She had friends. She had routines and favorite songs, food she loved, and people who loved her deeply. To them, she wasn't just Shaterica the officer. She was a sister, a daughter, a companion, maybe even a confidant on hard days. Her loss has left a hole in their lives that can never be filled. Those closest to her say she had a gentle way of expressing strength. She didn't raise her voice to command attention. She didn't need to. She carried herself with a quiet dignity. She was someone you could depend on, whether to show up on time, to follow through on a promise, or to simply listen when life became too heavy. She had lived in Alexandria, Louisiana, a city with deep roots and quiet neighborhoods. Ronmar Drive, where she lived, was one of those streets where people often waved to each other, where dogs barked from backyards and children played without worry. It was the kind of place where no one expected something tragic to happen, especially not to someone like her. But like many people, Shaterika may have carried private burdens behind her composed exterior. No one can fully know what happens within the four walls of someone's home. And in cases like this, where a domestic dispute ends in tragedy, it's a chilling reminder of how quickly peace can be replaced by heartbreak. There is very little public information about her relationship with Tracy Johnson, the 42-year-old man police say shot her before turning the gun on himself. Were they longtime partners? Roommates? Estranged lovers? That part of the story remains unclear. But what is known is this: there had been a moment or a buildup of moments that led to something irreversible. It's these unknowns that torment loved ones the most. When someone is taken suddenly, violently, and without explanation, it leaves behind a trail of unanswered question. What could have changed the outcome? Were there signs? Could anyone have intervened? These are the kinds of questions her loved ones may quietly wrestle with in the months and years to come. As her name began to circulate in news reports and online tributes, people started to remember the real her, the woman who smiled often, the professional who carried herself with grace, the friend who always showed up. It's easy to be consumed by the violence that ended her life. But her story began long before that, and it deserves to be remembered, because Shaterika Danielle Smith was not just a victim of a tragedy. She was a whole human being with depth, beauty, strength, and compassion. And even though her life was cut short in the most painful way imaginable, the way she lived will always matter more than the way she died. The relationship between Shaterika Smith and Tracy Johnson is one of the more elusive aspects of this heartbreaking story. Police reports list the incident as a domestic-related murder-suicide, suggesting a close, possibly romantic or cohabiting bond between them. But beyond that, little has been publicly confirmed. And yet, the absence of detail speaks volumes about how quiet and complex intimate relationships can be, especially when they carry pain behind closed doors. From the outside, their connection may have looked stable, perhaps loving. They lived under the same roof on Ronmar Drive in Alexandria, a small home that likely bore the marks of shared meals, late-night conversations, and routines built over time. In many cases, couples share laughter and hardship in equal measure, and no relationship is ever seen in full from the outside. Shaterika, known for her calm and composed demeanor, may have been the kind of person who kept her struggles private. Like many people who work in high-stress professions, especially women, she may have chosen to compartmentalize, separating her home life from her career. But that doesn't mean things at home were easy. And sometimes, it's in that quiet where tensions slowly begin to grow. As for Tracy Johnson, he was 42 years old, slightly older than Shaterika. Not much is known about his background, but in moments like these, we are reminded that tragedy often happens without warning. Those who knew him may have seen him as ordinary, perhaps a man who kept himself, or someone who once loved deeply but became overwhelmed by emotional storms he couldn't manage. Domestic relationships are layered. There may have been love there once, or habit, or hope. And in many stories like this, what begins as a connection between two people can evolve. Sometimes in healthy ways, sometimes in harmful ones. Whether their relationship was filled with kindness or control is something we may never fully know. But what is painfully clear is that something fractured. Something shifted in the space they shared. And that shift, whether gradual or sudden, became the turning point that changed everything. What we do know from law enforcement is that the incident that led to Shaterika's death was labeled as domestic in nature, a tragic outcome that often follows unresolved tension, emotional instability, or even past trauma. If there were warning signs, they may not have been visible to outsiders. That's often the case with domestic distress. It lives in shadows, hidden by smiles, overlooked by those who never imagined such a tragic end was possible. People who suffer in silence do so because of love, fear, shame, or even hope that things might get better. It's also important to recognize that relationships like theirs do not exist in a vacuum. Outside pressures, stress from work, financial struggles, unresolved emotional wounds can seep into the most personal spaces and magnify every disagreement. For a couple like Shaterika and Tracy, those stresses may have felt impossible to escape. In the days since their passing, many in the community have struggled to make sense of their relationship. Was it stable? Was it in crisis? Did Shaterika ever ask for help? Did Tracy ever reach out? These questions haunt those left behind, not out of blame, but out of heartbreak, a desire to understand how love could end in such deep loss. What remains is a picture of two people whose lives intersected in ways we may never fully understand. But one thing is certain. Whatever existed between them, the tragedy of that final morning erased a chance for healing, growth, or forgiveness. And now, we are left to honor Shaterika's memory, while also facing the painful truth that relationships, even those closest to us, can hold untold struggles. It was the early hours of Sunday, March 30th, 2025, when the stillness of the morning was suddenly disrupted by a call for help. Somewhere along Ron Marr Drive in Alexandria, Louisiana, the quiet of pre-dawn was pierced by something much more serious than a neighborly dispute or a momentary argument. At approximately 4:30 a.m., police received a report of a domestic disturbance. It was a familiar call, yet one they could never fully prepare for. Officers with the Alexandria Police Department responded swiftly. In small communities, officers often know the neighborhoods they patrol, and sometimes even the families they serve. But what they found upon arrival that morning was not something they could solve with calming words or a temporary separation. The damage had already been done. Inside the home, Shaterika Danielle Smith, 38, was found unresponsive with a gunshot wound. She had been shot fatally. The quiet, composed woman who had served her community as a corrections officer now lay lifeless in her own home. Her final moments are unknown, but what we do know is that she never deserved the terror or pain that likely preceded them. Nearby, Tracy Johnson, 42, was also found. He, too, had been shot, but in his case, the wound was self-inflicted. Authorities believe that after killing Shaterika, he turned the weapon on himself, ending his life as well. The entire event appeared to have occurred in rapid succession, leaving no time for intervention, no chance for a second thought. For investigators, the scene was heart-wrenching. 2 lives extinguished in a matter of moments. The home, once a private space shared by 2 individuals, had become a crime scene marked by tragedy. Yellow tape cordoned off the area as investigators began documenting every detail. The location of the weapon, the placement of the bodies, any signs of struggle or last words left behind. Outside, as the sun began to rise, the news started to trickle out. Neighbors peeked out their windows, stunned to see patrol cars and flashing lights in a place they had always considered safe. Many had no idea what had happened until reporters arrived, and police confirmed the details later that day. A normal Sunday morning had turned into one that would haunt the entire block for years to come. Back at the Alexandria Police Department, the case was officially labeled a murder-suicide, a classification no officer wants to use. For those who knew Shaterika, the words felt unreal. How could someone like her, so composed, so strong, be taken in such a violent final act? And how had things gotten so bad without anyone noticing? There are no easy answers. Often in domestic tragedies like this, the warning signs are either subtle or hidden. Perhaps there were arguments no one heard, emotional shifts no one saw. Perhaps there was an attempt to make things work, one that ended in hopelessness and silence rather than healing. We may never know what triggered that final, fatal moment. What we do know is this. In the span of a few minutes, 2 families were shattered. Children lost a parent. Friends lost a confidant. A community lost a woman who gave so much of herself to others. And in that same moment, any chance at reconciliation, growth, or justice was lost as well. The fateful morning of March 30th wasn't just the end of 2 lives. It was the beginning of a long grieving process for those left behind. A process filled with sorrow, confusion, and a desperate need to understand. And while nothing can undo what happened in those early hours, remembering and telling Shaterika's story is a small but vital step toward ensuring she is never forgotten. When officers arrived at the scene that morning, what they encountered was not an ongoing altercation, but the chilling silence that follows something irreversible. The call had come too late. The violence had already occurred. Now, all that remained was the overwhelming task of piecing together the final moments of two lives, one taken, one surrendered. Alexandria Police Department detectives immediately began securing the home. The front door was taped off. Neighbors were asked to stay inside, and crime scene technicians began photographing, measuring, and collecting evidence from every room. Inside that small house on Ronmar Drive, every detail mattered. Every footprint, every shell casing, every drop of blood. Family members were understandably devastated, and while grief and shock filled every conversation, they tried to help provide context about the relationship, about any recent tension, and about whether Shaterika had expressed fear or concern in the past. Some loved ones may have seen hints of unhappiness. Others may have had no warning at all. That's how tragedies like this unfold. Quietly, and then all at once. Autopsies were ordered. The coroner's report would later confirm what police already suspected. Shaterika died from a gunshot wound, and Tracy's wound was self-inflicted. There was no physical evidence to suggest anyone else was involved. The murder-suicide classification, while unbearably painful, brought at least a small sense of clarity to a case that left so many shaken. With the primary suspect deceased, there would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom justice. In some ways, that made the pain harder to bear. For Shaterika's loved ones, there would be no opportunity to face the man who took her life. No answers to the questions that keep them awake at night. Only a lingering silence where accountability should have lived. Detectives wrapped up their primary investigation within days, but the emotional fallout would take far longer to settle. Law enforcement issued a public statement confirming the murder-suicide ruling and reminding the public that domestic violence doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. They encouraged the community to speak up if they ever suspected someone was in danger. In these moments, police departments are not just enforcers of the law. They become messengers of heartbreak. Officers, many of whom had likely crossed paths with Shaterika professionally, were forced to carry out one of the most difficult tasks imaginable: informing her family, walking them through the investigation, and helping them understand the incomprehensible. Even as the investigation closed, the weight of what was lost remained. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic chase, no captured suspect. Just two lives gone in the span of minutes, and a community left holding the pieces. The police did their part, but in tragedies like this, justice doesn't always come in the form of an arrest. Sometimes, all we're left with is memory, mourning, and a shared promise to do better next time. In most criminal cases, tragedy is followed by a process: an arrest, a courtroom, evidence presented before a judge or jury, and ultimately, a verdict. But in cases like this, where the suspected perpetrator takes their own life, the legal road ends before it ever truly begins. For the family of Shaterika Danielle Smith, that reality made the grieving even more complex. There would be no formal charges, no opportunity to ask questions in a court of law, no legal consequences for the man believed to have taken her life. Once the Alexandria Police Department completed its preliminary investigation, the findings were passed on to the Rapides Parish Coroner's Office and the District Attorney's Office, as a standard in death investigations involving violence. Their task was to officially certify the cause and manner of death for both Shaterika and Tracy Johnson. The conclusion: homicide-suicide, consistent with the evidence gathered at the scene. The firearm used in both deaths was recovered and examined. Ballistics confirmed it was the same weapon that caused both gunshot wounds. Autopsy results supported the police report. Shaterika had sustained a fatal gunshot wound likely inflicted at close range. Tracy's wound was determined to be self-inflicted, consistent with the theory that he turned the gun on himself after killing her. Because Tracy was deceased, no charges could be filed. There was no prosecution, no bail hearing, no sentencing. The case was administratively closed, not because it lacked importance, but because the law simply had nowhere else to go. For the justice system, this was the end. But for Shaterika's loved ones, It was just the beginning of a lifetime of unanswered questions. In the absence of courtroom, accountability feels elusive. Families are often left in a state of emotional limbo, trying to make peace with the fact that there will never be formal justice. At least not the kind delivered through a judge's gavel. The lack of legal closure can deepen grief, leaving loved ones to search inward for healing instead of looking to the courts. Still, the case remains on record, preserved in police files, archived in public reports, and etched into the memories of those who knew the victims. Law enforcement officials use the opportunity to remind the public about the warning signs of domestic abuse and the resources available for those who might be suffering in silence. In their public statement, the Alexandria Police Department emphasized the importance of early intervention. Domestic violence doesn't always leave visible marks, they said. Sometimes it hides in silence, in subtle shifts of behavior, in moments when someone withdraws or isolates. Detectives encouraged anyone experiencing or witnessing possible domestic abuse to speak up before tragedy strikes. The legal process may have ended abruptly in this case, but the implications ripple outward. It raises questions about mental health support, conflict resolution, gun safety, and how our systems can do more to identify and support those in volatile situations. The administrative closure of the case was a legal formality, but it was not, and never will be, emotional closure for the people who loved Sheterika. In many jurisdictions, murder-suicide cases prompt reviews of public health protocols, victim advocacy efforts, and law enforcement training. Though these measures can't undo what happened, they're part of a broader effort to learn from every tragedy and protect others in the future. When lives are lost so suddenly and violently, the best we can do, beyond grieving, is to make sure those losses lead to awareness, change, and ultimately, prevention. So while there was no courtroom, no legal battle, and no verdict, there was a conclusion, an official record of what happened, and a call to action for the rest of us. A reminder that every tragic ending deserves reflection, that every victim deserves remembrance, and that even when the law can no longer act, our collective responsibility must continue. The loss of Sheterika Danielle Smith sent shockwaves through her family, workplace, and the broader Alexandria community. She wasn't a public figure, but she didn't need to be. To those who knew her, those who worked beside her, who shared laughter at the dinner table, who leaned on her in difficult times, Sheterika was a pillar of strength, grace, and quiet resilience. Her absence has been deeply felt, not just because of how she died, but because of how she lived. At FCC Pollock, where she served as a corrections officer, the grief was immediate and personal. Her co-workers remembered her as someone who was always calm under pressure, someone who led by example, and someone who brought a grounding energy into every space she entered. In high-stress environments, people like Sheterika become anchors, and when they're gone, the weight of that void is undeniable. Family members have spoken with a mix of heartbreak and reverence. They describe her as someone who always showed up, who gave her best, even when she was tired, and who loved deeply and without condition. Her smile, her voice, her unwavering sense of duty, these are the memories that remain. And they are not just holding on to those memories. They are sharing them so that others can know her light, even after it was taken. In her neighborhood on Ronmar Drive, the aftermath of the tragedy brought a somber stillness. The house, once just another home on a quiet street, has become a painful reminder of what happened. But neighbors didn't turn away. In fact, many came forward with flowers, condolences, and prayers, simple but powerful gestures that showed how deeply Sheterika had touched those around her. Her death also sparked conversations about domestic violence and mental health within the community. It served as a wake-up call, prompting friends and even strangers to check in on their loved ones, to ask harder questions, and to become more aware of the quiet signs that someone might be suffering behind closed doors. In this way, Sheterika's story has already begun to plant seeds of change. Online, tributes poured in from across the state and beyond. On memorial pages and in social media posts, people shared photos, prayers, and words of remembrance. They honored her by recalling her warmth, her professionalism, her kindness. For a woman who never sought the spotlight, it was a moving testament to how deeply she had impacted those around her. And though her family and friends now face a future without her, they are determined to carry her name forward. Not defined by tragedy, but remembered in truth. Shaterica Danielle Smith was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a colleague, a friend, and a woman who brought light to others. And as long as her story is told, her spirit lives on in the love she gave, the people she inspired, and the hope that her life, though tragically cut short, will inspire someone else to speak up, reach out, or ask for help before it's too late. The heartbreaking loss of Shaterica Danielle Smith is not just an isolated event. It is part of a much larger, deeply concerning pattern. Across the country, domestic violence continues to claim lives at an alarming rate. And in so many of these cases, the warning signs are quiet, the struggles are hidden, and the outcomes are tragically final. Shaterica's story, though deeply personal, reflects a national crisis that too often goes unspoken. One of the most painful truths about domestic violence is that it doesn't always look like what we expect. It's not always bruises or loud arguments. Sometimes it's emotional manipulation. Sometimes it's isolation, control, or the gradual erosion of someone's confidence and sense of safety. And often, the person suffering keeps it to themselves, out of fear, shame, or a desperate hope that things will get better. In Shaterica's case, we don't yet know the full extent of what may have been happening behind closed doors. But what we do know is that her death came in the hands of someone she knew, someone close. And that alone underscores how complex and dangerous domestic relationships can be. Many victims stay silent, not because they want to, but because they don't feel they have a way out. This is why early intervention matters so much. Friends, co-workers, and neighbors play a crucial role in recognizing when something seems off. Subtle changes in behavior, sudden withdrawal, or a shift in mood can be important signals. Asking, "Are you okay?" and being willing to listen without judgment can be the first step toward helping someone feel safe enough to speak up. It's also important to highlight that resources do exist. National and local hotlines, shelters, counseling services, and legal protections are available for those facing abuse or emotional harm. But awareness is key. So many people still don't know where to turn or fear the consequences of leaving a harmful relationship. That's why public education and conversations, like the one this story allows us to have, are so critical for men and women alike. This is a reminder that abuse can happen to anyone, and that it's never a sign of weakness to ask for help. If anything, it's a sign of strength, to recognize danger, to protect yourself, and to choose life over silence. Shaterica's death is devastating, but her story can spark life-saving action for others still living in quiet fear. By speaking her name and sharing her story, we honor not just her memory, but the lives of others who may still be in danger. We turn tragedy into awareness and pain into purpose. And in doing so, we hold on to hope that one day, fewer families will have to grieve the way hers now must. Today, the case of Shaterica Danielle Smith stands officially closed by the Alexandria Police Department. The evidence was clear. The timeline was devastatingly short. With Tracy Johnson deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, no legal proceedings followed. No trial. No cross-examination. No sentencing. But while the case may be closed on paper, for her loved ones and for the broader community, the emotional impact is still very much alive. Shaterica's family continues to mourn her loss, while also seeking ways to keep her memory alive, whether through private tributes, quiet reflection, or open conversations about what happened. They are finding strength in community and in one another. It takes unimaginable courage to move forward after such a traumatic loss, and yet her loved ones are doing just that, one day, one breath at a time. For those who work alongside her at FCC Pollock, Shaterica's absence is still felt in the hallways. Her dedication, her presence, her example, they don't fade with time. Her co-workers have expressed a commitment to remembering her not just as a colleague, but as a person of strength and integrity. Some have even begun to talk more openly about emotional health and the importance of checking in on one another. Her loss has sparked necessary, if difficult, conversations. As for the community at large, this tragedy has become a call to awareness, a reminder that domestic violence is not confined to a particular type of household or neighborhood. It can happen anywhere. It can affect anyone. And we all have a role to play in noticing, supporting, and advocating for those in harm's way. Silence protects no one. Compassion saves lives. So if you're watching this and someone comes to mind, someone who might be hurting, someone who's pulling away, or someone whose light seems dimmed, reach out, ask questions, offer support. Your words might be the lifeline they need. And if you are the one struggling, please know there is help. There are people who care, and you are not alone. This video isn't just a retelling of what happened. It's a tribute, a warning, and a promise. A tribute to Shaterica, a warning that domestic violence often hides in plain sight, and a promise that we will continue to speak, to share, and to fight for safety, awareness, and justice, especially when the system can no longer do so. Let Shaterica's story remind us all of how fragile life is, and how urgent it is to protect one another. Her voice may have been silenced, but through us, her legacy can still be heard. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Shaterica Danielle Smith's story. These aren't easy conversations to have, but they're important, because behind every headline is a real person with dreams, with people who loved them, and with a life that mattered. Shaterica's story isn't just about how she died. It's about who she was, and how we can honor her by paying attention to the quiet signs of pain that often go unnoticed. If this story moved you, please take a moment to share it. You never know who may be quietly struggling behind a smile, or who might need to hear that their life is worth protecting. Sharing Shaterica's story might inspire someone to check on a loved one, speak up, or finally ask for help. If you believe in the power of stories to bring awareness and healing, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to Lat True Crime Stories. We are committed to telling the stories that often go unheard, the ones that remind us of the fragility of life and the strength of community. Every like, every share, every subscriber helps amplify these voices and keeps their memories alive. We cover stories of heartbreak, injustice, survival, and resilience, not for shock, but for understanding. We believe that behind every case, there is something we can all learn and someone we can all remember with dignity. And that's why we do this, so that victims are never forgotten, and so that maybe, just maybe, another life can be saved. Until next time, stay kind, stay aware, and stay connected. For Shaterica and for every soul who didn't get a second chance, we remember you.